paused my Musume career to be here. Kim Ji-hoon is a little bit funny in the head because never in my life have I thought that I have so much to say over a PNG. Hello and welcome to my long yap about base egos for the Limbus Company sinners. I'm not gonna cover everyone in this video purely because this is a project that is way bigger than I actually thought. I actually started the script before Count of 7 came out and you can see how that turned out. Before we get started though, I want to mention that a large part of my analysis when it comes to interpreting the sin affinities related to the egos is based on the interpretations of the Tumblr user Lou's Not Okay. I'd highly recommend checking out his interpretations. With that out of the way, let us start with Gregor suddenly one day is a Sloth's ego costing 3 lust and 1 gloom to use. He has only a single effect, at up to 4, on hit, inflict 10 of a random status chosen from burn, bleed, tremor, rupture, and sinking. The ego's artwork depicts Gregor in a jail cell, with his bog arm tied up in a standard Limbus Center prisoner uniforms. The room is littered with broken weapons and the window in his cell depicts the smoke war, which he was a part of, while the walls are filled with silhouettes of mangled arms. Gregor himself is seen wearing an old G-Corp uniform, and smoking what is clearly not his first cigarette as apparent by the many smoked ones littering the ground below him. The ego represents Gregor's time in G-Corp during the smoke war, and encapsulates the way he views himself due to being a part of it. In addition to that, it represents his helplessness at him losing the control of his life, as much like in the book, suddenly one day, he has been completely robbed of his autonomy. According to Lou's Not Okay's interpretation of sloth, it is a sin of indifference, one of apathy and unwillingness to go against the status quo. It's not hard to imagine that a mindset like that could develop from someone serving in the army, especially on a losing side of a war under the circumstances that it happened in. It is also important to consider the smoke war itself. In Maxim's page in Library of Arena, we can read that many people who have been exposed to the smoke have been noted to frequently stare off into space and absent-mindedly wandering around the old L-Corp, as if returning to their old hometown. The smoke most likely produced some hallucinogenic effect that caused people to stagnate, which is probably related to how old L-Corp was producing energy. Who knows, maybe they were blending these zombie humans or melting them into something they could have used for energy, and the smoke itself was a byproduct that helped them get more fuel. The hallucinogenic smoke is undoubtedly related to the sloth in the ego, as it leads the residents of old L-Corp and the participants of the smoke war to lose their will and mind. And losing one's will is highly important to the concept of this ego, as Gregor is clearly broken by the events of the war, coping through his smoking addiction while contemplating the hardships he has been through. I personally believe that this ego represents the tail end of the war, as broken weapons laying on the ground are a clear symbol of the old G-Corp soldiers having to break their own bodies to turn themselves into living weapons and using themselves up to be left as nothing but vermin. We already know that Gregor is immensely ashamed of his arm, but there's a lot of visual representation of that are incredibly nice, such as him covering it up completely as if he's closing it off, and the silhouettes of mangled arms, representing how he had to mangle his own arm and how that is weighing on him. And the fact that he has covered his arm in the sinner prisoner uniform that signifies that it is the arm that makes him a sinner, not himself. It is the effect of his actions he was forced to, not once of his choice. It is also no coincidence that Gregor's arm is the thing in his body that got replaced. Arms are a symbol for the ability to do and make things, often representing one's autonomy, as it is the limbs that we rely most on to live our daily lives. Taking someone's arms is essentially taking away their ability to do anything by themselves in any kind of normal fashion. In a sense, it is killing their will. There is nothing Gregor can do about his arm. There is no remedy, no cure, no future. There is nothing he can do to go back to how he was, and he has simply accepted that no action of his will ever lead to anything worthwhile, as even his ability to be in control of things he does has been damaged. He's become a broken man, a perfect addition to the broken weapons littering the ground. I want to switch to the gameplay side of the ego now, since although this ego is completely dogshit there, it still reinforces the idea of Gregor's whole life going out of control and him giving up trying to remedy it. The ego applies 10 potency of a random negative status effect on an enemy. You're unable to choose which effect it is, much like he was unable to change the outcome of his life. But the fact that it exclusively applies negative effects corresponding to every sin affinity except pride and envy is a nice touch, as at the moment shown in the ego, Gregor is not only ignoring the consequences of his actions, much the opposite, he is very mindful and affected by them. There is no pride to be felt within him, nor is he able to act out of envy, as well he surely feels it and his wishes to be fully human. He has been robbed of his ability to choose a different path, and in his current state he just accepted the way he is. However, it is interesting to note that burn is a possible negative effect that can be spread, so it is possible that he feels an urge to make things right or wish to change the status quo, just without the ability to do it or the desire to try. He is a mere shell of what he was and has forsaken any desire to change his life for the better. The sense the ego needs to be used as 3 lust and 1 gloom. Taking them into account, it is easy to assume that to resonate with this moment and emotion, Gregor feels a strong desire to feel human and whole again, and despairing at the thought of that until he grows numb from the agony and stops willing to take his own life into his own hands. The sin resistances of the ego have Gregor become fatal to gloom, the wave of emotions and pain overpowering him, and envy, which is something he is unable to act upon but surely feels in great extents, causing him to feel the thorns getting under his skin. But to help with that, we have the ego's passive, uncontrolled morph. A simple passive that, much befitting of a cockroach, lets him stay alive for longer. Whenever Gregor gets low on HP, he heals and gets 2 protection, at the cost of an ally and an enemy getting SP down efficiency. Whenever someone is faced with a stressful and harmful situation, they tend to lock themselves in behind their shields that they put up to recover themselves. It is important to remember that indifference does not mean that the person is actively seeking harm for themselves. They could still do the bare minimum to survive, it would just lose all meaning to them. The same way as them doing so will take a mental toll on the people around them, the same way has worsened Gregor's relationship with his family in his book. There's one thing I want to touch upon with this ego that sticks out like a sore thumb to anyone who has played Lobcorp or Library of Arena. The emblems of Malkuth, Chezad, Gebra, Hokma, and Bina functioning as pins on his arm. There's an interesting theory by user Arena Queen on Reddit about the quotes that represent the respective Sapphira being relevant to Gregor, which I find pretty compelling. You can pause the video to read it, but in sum, all of them reinforce Gregor's soulful nature and add well to his ego. As to whether Gregor's ego is going to change or not, I believe there is a high chance of it changing its main sin from sloth to something like wrath in the moment of defiance against Herman. I could even see something like his ego voice line changing from something somber to accepting of his arm. The ego could also change to lust, or maybe even get a lust corrosion where Gregor will lose it and make his arm his whole identity, making him not embrace it but instead becoming his arm in a tragic way. Next comes a favorite gambler, Rodion, who has lost all the spotlight in her own Kanto on the poker table, but at least managed to win a Reimshang. However, Reimshang is not the point of our discussion here, but rather her actual base ego, what is cast. A pride ego that costs 3 pride and 1 gloom, and whose pride depicts Rodion holding a bloodied axe as the floor is littered with bloodied up small dolls. Outside through the window, we see a snow-covered street with corpses. Her ice-cold axe is dripping with fresh blood and is getting discolored from blue to purple. She tosses a coin in the air and with a confident grin on her face. What's cast is cast. Probably one of my favorite ego sprites visually, as it showcases a lot about Rodion's character, especially if you add the ego's effects and passives. Speaking of those, the ego has a couple attributes. Whenever a target has over 50% health, the ego deals 30% more damage, and on its coin, it inflicts 4 bleed and causes Rodion to gain a boost to healing and losing SP. Same thing happens on the ego passive. This leads us to a very obvious conclusion. Rodion is incredibly unstable and is easily pushed into either side of the emotional spectrum due to that fact. But let's keep that on the back burner a little while we take a look at the ego sprite and try to understand what is going on in it. The most striking visual feature of the ego is the countless bloody dolls, all seemingly bleeding from the head inside and just as many actual dead bodies outside. It isn't exactly clear that these things are dolls, but them being that way fits nicely if you think about book Rodion's belief of him being superior. Having people be represented by dolls feels like quite well. As mentioned, the dolls and corpses are all bleeding from the head, and while they did not die from the illness of the mind that Carmen spoke of, all of them died the same way as the tax collector that Rodion killed. A lot of the dolls have wounds on many parts of their bodies, and corpses outside look straight up mangled. The big through line is always blood around the head, as Rodion is standing there holding a bloodied up axe. It is a reasonable assumption that whatever happened to the dolls was her doing. All of the dolls are covered in many different injuries, while clearly only the one to the back of the head produces blood out of them, killing them. Let's also make another assumption, that the dolls parallel the corpses outside, which reflect the aftermath of the middle punishing the neighborhood. If the dolls all died the way the tax collector did, and Rodion is responsible for all of their injuries, then she's responsible in a way for all the corpses outside. If we make the assumptions given, the dolls are showing how she feels at fault for every death and injury caused by the middle's punishment as a stem from her actions. It would also be appropriate to mention that the ego is portraying a moment in winter. While the part of the flashback itself takes place during winter, as snow can be seen in CGs, I believe that the presence of snow is a symbolic aspect. Winter for most cultures represents a couple of things: dormancy, peace, and change. Animals hibernate in winter, snow piles up and completely covers what is hidden beneath. Whatever is frozen in ice can be preserved inside for thousands if not millions of years. In nature, winter represents the natural tendency for things to cover up and stay dormant until it passes. And that extends to us humans. As we progressed past nature, we began to cover ourselves in clothing and fill the ice to withstand the harsh, unbearing cold. And there is no one better at running from the cold than Rodion. Rodion refuses to face herself, even if her actions and nature stare her dead in the face. She is someone who is characterized by hiding her emotions, coping with her past, by covering up his layers and layers, hoping it will never get thawed to stare her in the face. She finds peace in the cold continuing to exist, as while it is there, she can continue to cover up and seek shelter from the past, not unlike what she does in the ego spread itself. Rodion is facing away from the corpses outside. There is a wall between her and them, and as she hides herself from the frigid outside, she guilts herself over her actions. No matter how much she buries them, they find ways to seep through the snow. The scarlet blood rings bright from the pale cloth that's over it, continuing to shine brighter as the snow that covers it begins to melt, which will eventually force Rodion to come to terms with how things really are. But what is it that Rodion so desperately tries to cover up? Well, just as Sonia said it himself, she couldn't stand the fact that she wasn't anyone special. It was something that even the tax collector woman taunted her for, that she was trying to be a savior. A lot of people seem to think that Limbus Rodion is quite a departure from her original book counterpart, but turning to the book will help us understand Rodion and her mind much better. Book Rodion is a miserable man of low status who is leading an okay life but nothing that special. But above all, he is a very distant man who believes himself to be split from society. He believes that there is a certain class of people who stand above the majority, people who should be allowed to do anything so long as they actually have a special quality that allows them to take the step forwards past the doorstep. Rodion in his delirium that is caused by his illness, under his bloated hubris, decides that he is one of those people and convinces himself to murder a pawnbroker to gather her money and use it to better himself into a more well-off life. However, things don't go as planned as he ends up murdering the pawnbroker's sister as well and flees in what could possibly be the luckiest escape ever, only to hide the stolen goods under a rock and never use them all throughout the book. The entire book he is plagued by guilt over his actions. However, he copes by first gaslighting himself that he has done the right thing until his pride dissolves through Sonia's influence and he eventually turns himself in. Limbus Rodion is not that much different from that. She was also born into an impoverished society where she was unable to carve out an identity for herself. Seeing the people around her suffering, she rashly decided to help through an outburst, but even for that she was not recognized, as the middle punished everyone they saw. What Rodion wants most is to stand out, a trait that is at the very core of a person like Sonia, which is where we can assume that Rodion is actually incredibly jealous of Sonia, or someone who can have such a strong identity that it is separating from the collective and is actually drawing everyone to him. I would like to circle back to the relevant set of affinities for the ego, starting with the affinity of the ego itself, pride. It is really hard to say that Rodion killing it was anything but prideful. She clearly rushed in, not thinking of the consequences of killing a person related to the middle, and thinking she can be great too, and ended up indirectly causing a massacre. Although this sounds more closer to wrath if you consider the context of Rodion wanting to make a change, I believe that the real reason behind Rodion doing this is closer to the book Rodion, is her desire to be just as good as Sonia. It is her sadness and her pride that caused her to make that decision, which is reflected in the sin affinities used to call the ego forth. And another thing to mention is that after using this ego, Rodion becomes fatal to both gloom and envy. She becomes unable to handle the pain and sadness that comes with being merely average, and that emotion keeps bottling up inside of her because she was exposed to Sonia and genuinely envied him and how people clung to him. A cool detail in the ego spread itself is that the axe she's holding has a light blue to purple gradient, sort of tracing the reasons behind her actions in order of depth. The handle is light blue, symbolizing it is her gloom that led her to pick up the axe, the blade being darker blue symbolizes that it is her pride that made her kill, and the actual sharp end of the blade being purple for envy symbolized that the actual reason she killed her was because she was jealous of not being as special as others. I would also really quickly like to address the coin she is tossing up in the air. A coin toss is indicative of leaving something up to chance or letting how something is tossed or cast decide how it falls. For a lot of people, it is a way to avoid decisions and responsibility by shifting the decision to an inanimate object or to leave themselves up to fate. I believe that it is a relevant idea when it comes to Rodion, as she is someone who copes not only by hiding from her past and running away, but also by surrendering the choices within her life to someone else to avoid that consequence. She cannot take back what has already happened, so to make sure it does not happen again, it will be far more convenient to just blindly let someone else make the decisions for her. This is actually quite tragic to see, as Rodion did genuinely want to make a change, albeit if her reasons for it were not truly selfless. Having her spirit and desire for change to be squashed under the consequences of her actions that were forced upon her peers through a system she lived in is not something that someone who deals with issues like this can face, so she simply gave up and got herself living a gambler's lifestyle. Whatever happens, happens. What is cast is cast. It also feels oddly culturally relevant, as the idea of brilliant people being lessened under the system they live in is not only prevalent in Crime and Punishment itself through Rodion's beliefs, but is also a larger commentary on the culture that is highly prevalent to many Slavic, especially post-USSR countries. Why would I want to be great when I tried and the system forced me to back down into place after all? Going back to the ego itself though, if it ever gets a change, I believe that staying as Sprite would be the best for Rodion as a person. For her, accepting what she did and facing that head on is exactly what she needs to do before she can realize her own strength and what she can do to feel accomplished. Staying the way she currently is will eventually jade her deep down, and she won't be able to keep up that cheerful mask that she carries. She will submit to being average, a mere pawn in the system, an ordinary, unimpressive, far from great nobody, and that is represented by the Reimsheng ego. So in a healthier state of mind, Rodion's ego should probably represent pride or maybe wrath if she fully commits to being genuinely selfless about her beliefs. In addition to that, I'd love to see her catch an axe swinging back at her and deliver another blow with it, maybe making it a Tuku ego to symbolize her being able to face the consequences coming her way. This is a fairly shallow breakdown of her character, and I wish I could say more, but to spare you time, I was just saying these wonderful Reddit posts by Nirazar and Selfie21 talking about Rodion for a more kosher aspect of her design and her character in the time-killing time event. Range of Knowledge Sinclair is an ego that sucks in gameplay, but is incredible when it comes to visual and thematic design. In fact, it is such a package deal that I have no idea where to start. This ego has a lot, and I mean a lot of Christian and philosophical symbolism to it, so let us start with talking about the gameplay and introduce the relevant concepts through that. The ego went through some changes when it comes to its mechanics over time, so I would personally be using the most recent version of it, as it is the best possible representation of the themes it embodies. Branch of Knowledge Sinclair is a gluttony ego that is all about duality. On head's hit, he has the following effects. It applies 12 Rupture, makes Sinclair lose 10 SP, and gives him 1 attack power up next turn. If he hits Tails, it makes him gain 10 SP and gives him 1 protection next turn. Its passive, Unstable, makes him lose 5 SP and gain 1 damage up for this turn if the coin he hits with a different side from the previous coin in the same skill. From this alone, the duality aspect of the ego becomes fairly clear. If Sinclair is doing good, it pushes him further but makes it slightly harder to do good. If he's doing bad, it doesn't let him fall harder, but makes it slightly harder to do bad. Before we start talking about how this is relevant, let us discuss the visual design of the ego itself. The ego portrays Sinclair sitting in an old chair made of wood, with the lighting in the room split right down the middle, where his front side is mostly illuminated, but his back side is mostly in the dark. The dark side seems to be far more unkempt, as it is littered with tree leaves which have long withered away and are absent from the bright side of the room. Above him hangs a golden apple, also split in half with the room's lighting, but its glow is not shadowed over in the dark side. The room also has a visible shadow of a tree with a snake wrapped around it, and exclusively on the bright side of the room one can see a window of what looks like Sinclair's family, with him included, all having prosthetic heads, celebrating. The titular branch of knowledge is sitting right beside Sinclair, its roots on the bright side of the room, its axe on the dark side. It's really hard to avoid the obvious Christian symbolism that comes with this ego, particularly with what is obviously the tree of knowledge of good and evil, with a serpent wrapped around it, and with the apple, the fruit that Eve ate, hanging from the top of the screen. However, despite all that, it is far more important to discuss how all of this is related to the original book and the ideas presented in it. Sinclair's whole thing was always about the duality between what's right and what's wrong. Sinclair grew up in a sheltered household, raised to be a good boy, to obey the rules, and to do what is right. For his entire life, he has been curious about what is outside of the world he has lived in. Although he knew that what's out there is wrong, he felt a strong pull towards it. And that became the reason that he eventually got entangled in that world. Being pulled by Damien's ideas, he ends up indulging in the dark side of himself until he feels drawn to the light side again. The cycle repeats until he eventually finds a balance between the two and learns to coexist within them. The tree of knowledge of good and evil in Christianity, at least in my interpretation, is meant to represent morality and the way we as humans are reasoning and judging each other. We have a preset knowledge of what is good and what is evil, so we can decide if something is one or the other, so to speak. Before eating the fruit, both Adam and Eve have lived lives free of judgment and opinions of others. To quote Genesis 2:25 in the Bible, Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. The idea behind that is, as soon as they tasted the fruit, they began to separate things into right or wrong, therefore losing the ability to coexist. And the main idea behind Damien's teachings to Sinclair is acceptance of both of these sides within yourself, so that you can coexist with everyone again. It is, in a way, going from an ignorant, blissful community to a group of individualistic people who are unable to put others with themselves, to a community of individuals, each unique in their own right. The shadow of the tree is looming over Sinclair is a direct representation of that. It, like most things in the ego, is split into two separate halves, with the serpent present on both of them, a sign that there are things tempting you to experience the other side regardless of where you are. The glowing gold apple is the only thing in the image that is immune to this duality. Its glow is shining brightly in both halves, and it seems to be unaffected because it exists outside of the shadow itself. It is a mere projection of an ideal world where one could experience the tree to gain understanding and individuality, but without being separated from the others. Looking at the objects in the ego, Sinclair himself is sitting on a chair that is entirely in the dark side of the room. In fact, most of Sinclair's body is on that side of the room, with only his face, his hands, and his feet being present on the light side. I believe that this is the representation of how, being on the darker side of the world, he still aims towards the light side, despite still being mostly on the dark side. He does not stand up, he is firmly sitting in the comfort of the dark world, and at the same time he is wishing for the comfort of the light world. There is also the barred view of him and his family with prosthetic heads, who is one of the four people sitting apart from the rest, slightly right where Sinclair and the ego is sitting, and with the line of the two worlds conveniently dividing him away from the rest of the family. It is possible that this is representing what he fears most, as in a way, tasting the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil is making it harder to connect with people because you cannot accept them. He was not able to accept the prosthetics of his family, so he felt alienated from them and would continue to feel that way if he got one himself. Now let's address the namesake of the ego, the branch of knowledge. As I have mentioned before, I personally interpret the tree of knowledge of good and evil as the reason people separate from each other by finding out differences and assigning them labels such as good and evil. It is through this lens that we can interpret the tree itself as a system of morality and its branch as a tool of enforcing it. Through wielding this branch, Sinclair is deciding what is good and what is worth keeping and what is bad and is worth cutting down. The branch itself is split down the middle as well, divided between the tree's roots and an axe, which can be seen as symbols for something sprouting and something being cut down. What is interesting is that the roots of the branch are seen in the light, to possibly symbolize that the things considered as good is where the branches of knowledge of what is good and isn't good are growing from, possibly referring to how it is what is considered good that can decide if something is evil or not. In its opposition, the axe part of the branch is located on the dark side, both there to cut down the evil, but also to symbolize that the pull to wish to do so stems from an evil within us, supported by the fact that the leaves are only growing on the side of the branch that is within evil. Now, I'm sure a big detail would be sticking out like a sore thumb. The branch itself is not planted anywhere, nor is it on a tree. In fact, it looks uprooted, and Sinclair talks about severing it with his own hands in the eagle line. I personally believe that it is a representation of Sinclair's desire to decide what is right and what is wrong all on his own. As we see in Count of Three and the one who shall grip Sinclair ID, Sinclair has been surrounded by people who will force the concepts of good and evil onto him, deeming some things as heretical and wrong, even if they're considered normal, and deeming some good things beyond despicable. It is through this desire to sever the branch of good and evil and to take it into his own hands, to pass judgment on his own, that he's able to not become like his bad end ID. And what I believe his main character arc is all about. After all, self-growth, self-judgment, and self-rebirth are not only pivotal to Sinclair, but are also connected to the concept of Abraxas in the original book. Abraxas is a pagan god that is described as a combination of the digits making up the number 365, and was depicted as the body of a snake and the head of a rooster. Sinclair has always been tied to a motif of a chick breaking out of its egg, as it is a very common metaphor for birth, rebirth, and breaking out of its shell. It is also a metaphor for accepting yourself. Here, I would like to raise a very relevant quote from the book, one that is probably the most well known. The bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. Who will be born must first destroy a world. The bird flies to God. God's name is Abraxas. I believe it represents the idea I was talking about earlier, the one about Sinclair wishing to sever the branch of the tree for his own use. choose. Destroying the world could possibly mean just going against it and breaking conventions. It is a path of self-discovery and self-actualization that seeks to branch off from the collective and become someone unique that would not be stigmatizing others for not being you. Breaking the shell and becoming yourself is what the quote represents in my eyes, but flying towards Abraxas could be meaning that the temptation to engage with this kind of thought is what births the desire in the people in the first place. As I mentioned earlier, Abraxas' lower body is made up of snakes, the symbol for temptation, which Sinclair is highly susceptible to. Speaking of being susceptible to things, Branch of Knowledge sin weaknesses makes Sinclair fatal to wrath and pride, both affinities of someone with strong convictions and beliefs. Much like Cromer is her duality that she seeks to make wholeness, and much like Damien who seeks for self-discovery within everyone, it also makes him resist gluttony, possibly indicating that he himself is heavily experiencing strong desires for more. In the future, it is highly possible that the ego will change to pride if Sinclair does reach a point at which he will be able to confidently swing down the branch of knowledge to decide everything for himself. If gluttony represents his desire to make these decisions for himself due to wanting to break free from the morality of others being forced onto him, pride will represent him engaging with his unique knowledge of good and evil and judging everyone based only on what he thinks. And side note, Sinclair will 100% get the judgment with ego. I am dying on this hill, I do not care what anyone else says. Crow's eye view is surprisingly simple when it comes to references, referencing exclusively its source material from as far as I can tell, but it is just as filled with symbolism as the other ego. The room Yi-sang is in is perfectly sterile and white when it comes to the walls and flooring, which is something that is the case only for him and Faust, but unlike Faust, the bricks making up the walls are perfectly symmetrical with regards to their placement, in a way fitting perfectly with each other in columns instead of laying out in ways that provide more support and structure. Now, the reason I decided to address the contents of the room rather than Yi-sang or the items in the room itself is because his room does not really feel like a prison cell like for pretty much every other sinner. It feels much more like a padded cell in a psychiatric ward. Padded cells, also often called personal safety rooms, often carry a sense of solitary confinement for one's own safety and often involuntarily placement in them. Before I start connecting that to the original book, let us finish looking at the ego art. Yi-sang sits on the ground in the middle of the ego, reading some book. His thinner jacket is falling off his shoulder, and beneath it, some smeared ink splatter transitions into glass shards, lettering the floor in the shape of wings. To his front, there is a knife that vaguely looks like a crow feather wedged into the ground, and above him, a looming shadow of a bird's wing towers over him, but never covering him. What it does cover, however, is the window in the room that shows a small room with a bunch of mirrors on the wall. The best way to describe Yi-sang's room would be desolate. It is, as I said earlier, sterile, with no furniture of any kind, and all of the objects present are something Yi-sang would have on himself at all times. This paints a pretty good picture about the inside of his mind being fairly lonesome, or as I said, desolate. Going back to the padded room connection. Unlike for every other sinner, Yi-sang's ego does not feel like an inner view of someone's mind, much more like a temporary residence he holds no attachment to. A lot of Yi-sang's character revolves around his lack of agency and him downplaying himself, even though deep down he strives for something greater, especially if it is the cause of someone else establishing an environment for him through which he slowly dies as a person and becomes a shell of what he used to be. This slow degradation process is shown very well through how Yi-sang's wings modify his hand. This ego has two important presences of wings in it. Yi-sang's own wings made from shards of glass on the ground, and the shadow of an actual bird wing in the direction he's looking at. Before we address the wing he's facing, let us address the wings he's turning away from, his own. The glass shards on the ground are clearly disconnected from his body, as they're not in place where the wings would reasonably come out of, but their beginning portion is covered by his center jacket. An interesting detail to note is the smeared ink coming out of the sleeve and in 2 points in the back of the jacket. Ink is often synonymous with writing, and it is really relevant to mention that Yi-sang is based more so on the works of the author with the same name, as a lot of his works are semi-autobiographical in nature. And writing in ink is specifically a sign of something being final, as unlike writing in pencil, it is not erasable. The way the ink splatter is also done, at least to me, is reminiscent of blood, especially considering that we see it in places where his wings are beginning on the ground, where his left hand should be. The blood analogy goes two ways. The first one is representing him losing these parts of his body, both the wings and his left hand. Losing the wings is pretty self-explanatory, but his left hand is a little more subtle. In the main story, we see that the mirror Yi-sang that LCB Yi-sang talks to is noted to be left-handed, and as Plethora of Squids points out on Reddit, it does not allow the mirror Yi-sang and LCB Yi-sang to shake hands. Shaking hands being a metaphor for understanding and accepting oneself in this case. To understand the other relevant interpretation for the blood ink symbol, we have to look at the real-life Yi-sang, who died at the age of 26 from tuberculosis, and was noted to be coughing up blood. Getting diagnosed with tuberculosis has clearly caused a shift in Yi-Sang's writing, as both the Wings and Crow's Eye View were written after the diagnosis and decently close to his death, which reflected in the depressing subject matter addressed in them. It is my personal belief that the diagnosis has caused him to lament the lost possibilities of his future, as the closer he got to his death, the more he knew he was going to die, and the more he looked back at his past self thinking he failed himself. Poem 4 in the collection of poems titled Crow's Eye View is a 10 by 10 grid of mirrored numbers, 1 through 9 with dots going diagonally up to the left, starting from the bottom right corner. The text on the sides is a date and a caption for the image. Above, diagnosis by the primary doctor, Yi-Sang. The poem itself was incredibly divisive, as in a way it is not a poem at all. As when printed, it had to be printed as an illustration and not using actual characters, as it was impossible to print the numbers mirrored, and outside of that, to many people, it was a bunch of gibberish. Some say that the poem is supposed to represent an extra of his own lungs, and with the mirrored nature of the numbers and the misaligned columns, with everything below the dots being one digit behind, showing that something is off. But a far more interesting interpretation is one of a journey of his state of mind as he's getting closer and closer to death. At the time of publishing that poem, Korean was mostly written in a top-down, right-to-left fashion, so if you look at the sequence of numbers with that in mind, it shows the progress of something passing. The rightmost column being made up of mostly ones with a dot at the bottom, then the one to the left being made up of twos followed by a dot and a one at the bottom, and so on, with each column being one less of its current digit and one more of its previous digit, as it keeps going all the way until we get to a column with a dot at the start and 9 nines below it. I personally view it as Yi-Sang looking back on his life more and more as he gets closer to the end, since closer we are to the end, the more the column is taken up by a number before it. In addition to that, all of the numbers are always facing the previous number, as if it is someone from the past column that wrote them out, sort of as a set of expectations of what the writer will be like, contrasted with the actual reality of him not reaching them due to illness. The unreached expectations only growing the closer he is to the end. The through line of the two sets of expectations of oneself can be seen in another poem from Crow's Eye View, poem 15. It describes his narrator being afraid of his doppelganger in the mirror and wanting to kill him, but in the end killing himself and believing he is guilty of a crime of holding both of them hostage. In the poem, the narrator describes himself as someone lonely to whom even one's own incompetence is passable. And that line paints a better understanding as to why Yi-Sang felt so conflicted about his own expectations of himself. In his own eyes, he sees his life as something rushing towards its end, and has accepted that he will not be able to do anything to stop it. There is nothing he can make of himself anymore, for there is no reason to. He does not have the time. In contrast, the man in the mirror is a representation of a brighter future for Yi-Sang, and the possibility that he will never be. He will never be like the him in the mirror, because the him in the mirror is backwards. Not the same way he is the general line of thought that is carried through the narrator's thoughts. The same poem also mentions how the two could never shake hands due to one of them being right-handed and the other left-handed, circling us back to the difference between Yi-Sang feels from the past him that dreamt a better future for him and the current him that has given up and accepted his fate. It is for that reason that the narrator views himself as a sinner, holding both of them back. He is not letting the man in the mirror exist to you how he is, but he is also dooming himself by just existing. He is prescribing suicide to the man in the mirror to show that deep down, death is his only way forward. The poem collection is titled in a fairly ominous way. The usual phrase bird's eye view to indicate a great height is used to be crow's eye view to specify who is looking down. Crows are a symbol for death, so the title could be interpreted as the looming presence of death washing over the narrator and is what causes him to think the way he does. It makes him give up expecting a future where he is free to be anything he wants. The fact that he is to die is cutting his wings. Why do birds fly? It is because they have wings. In Yi-Sang's case, however, his preconceptions are what caused him to lose them. Unlike in real life, however, LCB Yi-Sang is not dying. Instead, his preconceptions are stemming from the league breaking down and him being stuck only with his own invention, observing a himself that is far happier than he is and far more successful. To him, the self in the mirror is something to be admired and looked up to, as he sees him to be someone free within his ability to choose. This is an antithesis to the way the narrator in Crow's Eye View talks about the man in the mirror. However, in The Wings, the narrator there mentions playing with his wife's mirror and being quite fond of it, which goes away as his mental state worsens. So to him, the mirror used to represent something of a hope, a possibility for a better future, which is what is reflected in the glass shards that are littered in the shape of wings on the floor. Each one of those glass shards is a possibility for Yi-Sang, a different different mirror world where he could have been having wings. But even though he believes his wings are gone for good as indicated by the ink stains on the ground, something is there to cover the stains. The LCB center jacket is not only the possible cause of the smeared ink, but is also outright covering the vast majority of it, showing that LCB could be what allows Yi-sang to not let his temporary loss of wings be final. And that is indicated in the other important presence of wings in the ego, the shadow of the big wing that covers half the room. It is a symbol of something that Yi-sang is meant to look up to, however he is not looking up at it, merely just in its direction. In addition to that, he himself is not covered by its shadow at all, and what is covered instead is the room with the many mirrors which represent all the identities he can be in life. His dream of wings is cutting those choices off for him, literally barring them off in the back of his mind, as to dream of wings is to say that you yourself do not possess them. It is through his ego awakening at the end of Canto 4 that Yi-sang is able to stand in a room full of mirrors to regain the shape of his wings, full of luster in the future for him to become. If there is ever a change to his ego, I'd like for it to change from sloth to pride, or even something like wrath or lust. The main thing is that his ego being sloth would be hard to justify down the line, and the three most likely options are the sins I just mentioned. Pride for acting out in ways to prove his wings, which might lead him to make choices that do not necessarily align with everyone else's wishes, and that is an unlikely outcome knowing him. It is far more possible for his ego to become lust, to represent his desire for wholeness or completeness, or wrath, to represent his desire to be the one acting and using sad wings. Snack Harpoon. And with that, part 1 comes to a close. I wanted to at first cover everyone up until dawn, but as I kept making the script, I realized that there was just so much to say about these egos that if I did cover more sinners, the video would take even longer to come out. I hope I will be able to make a part 2 soon, but we all know how I am. That's all, follow me on Twitter, I retweet Abu Muji card and like the visual novels. Peace.